America's presidents are in our view today. Donald Trump will become the country's 47th president, in addition to his term as number 45. As that administration continues to form and then takes office this month, we are also looking back. The only Georgian to lead from the White House, Jimmy Carter, died a week ago. We're talking about his impact. And the man who came after Carter remains a beloved figure. Ronald Reagan's leadership and legacy, and what modern-day leaders can learn from his example. All of that today on This Week in Jacksonville. Well, good morning to you. Welcome to our first show in 2025. Now, today we're looking way back and we're looking forward. Donald Trump's second presidential administration begins in 2 more weeks and a day. And over the next week, the nation will pay tribute to and remember our 39th president, Jimmy Carter, who passed away a week ago. His funeral will be Thursday. Now, during our time together today, we're joined by someone who has unique insights into governing and the people who lead. Peggy Grande wrote the book, The President Will See You Now, My Stories and Lessons from Ronald Reagan's Final Years. And Peggy's joining us virtually now from Washington. Peggy, we're going to discuss your connection with President Reagan in detail a little later in our show. First, though, let's discuss the legacy of President Jimmy Carter. I know I read this article. You just wrote an opinion piece on him. And one of the things that stood out is you're saying, hey, legacies aren't made after we pass away. It's what happens with every day of our lives.
Absolutely. And thank you, Ken, so much for having me on. And I love how you frame that. This is a time that we as a nation are both looking backwards and forwards. And I feel so fortunate to have had a front row seat to do both of those things, having served for President Reagan and serve for President Trump, and hoping to also participate in the 47th administration of President Donald Trump as well. But as you said, we're looking back and reflecting on Jimmy Carter, who both sides of the political aisle probably look at his as, for in general, a failed presidency for the most part. But we look at his post-presidency, where this is a man who was very intentional about continuing in the lane of public service. He did a lot of good with Habitat for Humanity, with election observances all over the world. And so my piece in Fox News, I make the argument that none of us can be judged totally by our lowest point of our life, but by the totality of our life. And so if we look at the totality of Jimmy Carter's life, in essence, he was, I think, somebody that we can look back on and say he was a great American. He stepped into public service. He served in the Georgia State Senate. He served as governor and, of course, as president of the United States. He also served our nation in the Navy. And so we should thank him at a time of patriotism and gratitude as we're remembering his life at a time of national mourning, and not through the lens of partisanship, but really of patriotism. And he did serve our nation in so many ways.
And Peggy, I was very young, so were you. You were even younger when President Carter was in office. But even as a youngster, I remember, boy, this was a really tough time, a very difficult time in our country's history. Stagflation with high unemployment, high inflation, all of that going on. The odds were stacked against President Carter. And as you point out, whether we view that in a partisan lens on what he accomplished or didn't accomplish, the 40 years after he left office, just staggering to see the way that he made an impact, not just in Plains, Georgia, where he went back to, but across the country and really across the globe, eventually a Nobel Peace Prize winner.
Yes. And, he really was leader during a time of national malaise. But maybe we have that to thank for leading to the ushering in of Ronald Reagan, who I served and had the privilege of serving as his executive assistant for 10 years post-presidency. And really the failed years of the Carter presidency opened up the doors for Ronald Reagan to step in. And we see that leadership matters. And we look at Ronald Reagan as somebody who stepped in on the heels of the Carter presidency. At the end of the Carter presidency, the end of the 1970s, as you mentioned, taxes were high, inflation was high, unemployment was high, and worst of all, American morale was incredibly low. But Ronald Reagan took office, and on day one, he begins talking about it's morning in America. He ushers in a new era where Americans had patriotism and pride and wanted to be part of a resurgence of American exceptionalism. And so Reagan ushered that in, and so many of us got to be part of that during the 80s and then beyond that as well. So maybe we have Carter to thank for bringing in the rise and the greatness of the Reagan era as well.
I appreciated in your opinion piece that you just referenced here about President Carter that you went to 1986, October 86, President Carter's, the dedication ceremony for the Carter Presidential Center in Atlanta. Share with us what President Reagan said in his speech there.
Yeah, I love what he said, and I think they're great words for all of us to adhere to. And he says, none of us today should feel any urge in the name of goodwill to downplay our differences. On the contrary, in a certain sense, we can be proud of our differences because they arise from goodwill itself, from love of country, for concern for the challenges of our time, from respect for, and yes, even outright enjoyment of the democratic processes of disagreement and debate. Today, our very differences attest to the greatness of this nation, for I can think of no other country on earth where two political leaders could disagree so widely, yet come together in mutual respect. Reagan was always great to focus on the commonality, the things that brought us together, which is a love of country and a love of service. And we should do the same and follow Reagan's model in looking for the common ground, not highlighting always the differences.
Peggy, was there a common respect or a mutual respect between President Reagan and President Carter?
Absolutely, there was. And there were many times when the former president's club, if you could call it that, the most elite club probably in the world, they would gather. And so even when the Reagan Library was dedicated, President Carter came all the way from Africa, where he was observing elections there, to be in attendance. And so regardless of partisanship, they all gathered, whether there was a solemn or a celebratory occasion. The President's Club would always gather. And I was so fortunate to be at many of those gatherings and to watch these former presidents or sitting presidents interact. And wow, what a club.
Yeah. Well, as we said, Peggy, I'm going to ask you to stay with us because our guest here has a personal connection to President Ronald Reagan. We're going to talk much more with Peggy Grande about her up-close look at the presidency, and that's next on This Week in Jacksonville. Don't go anywhere.
You're watching This Week in Jacksonville with Kent Justice.
And welcome back. Our guest today, Peggy Grande, has a personal connection to former President Ronald Reagan. She wrote the book, The President Will See You Now, My Stories and Lessons from Ronald Reagan's Final Years. Peggy is with us today from Washington. And Peggy, tell us about your connection to President Reagan and really how that began back in 1989.
Right. Well, thank you, Kent. And, I feel like the luckiest woman in the world. I had a front row seat to history and had the opportunity and privilege of serving President Ronald Reagan as his executive assistant for 10 years in his post-presidency. I started in that role as basically an intern when I was a student at Pepperdine University. I had been a communications major, and politics was just something that was maybe a little hobby or interest on the side, never imagining I would get an opportunity to serve that man in such a capacity. So starting as an intern, I then started working as the executive assistant to the chief of staff. And a couple years into my service there in the office of Ronald Reagan, I was asked to serve President Reagan. So I got to be the lucky lady to sit right outside his office door every day and interface with him, the office staff, everybody from the public to world leaders. And what an opportunity to serve that man and to get to really know him as a person, not just a president. And that's what I've written about in my book.
I was really interested in some of those stories, starting with the fact that after he left Washington, D.C., went back to California, and then in Southern California, what were those 10 years like? What does a former president, at least in President Reagan's case, what does he do with his time? I'm sure lots of people want to see and meet with him and all those sorts of things.
Absolutely. And, there really is no rule book or manuals guide for what a former president is supposed to do. And so every president has done it a little bit differently. We just talked about President Carter, who chose to build homes for Habitat for Humanity and observed elections worldwide. A lot of it depends on how old they are when they leave office as well. Ronald Reagan was already very elderly by the time he left office, whereas you get a President Clinton or a President Obama that are leaving office at a very young age and have have many more decades of life to write ahead of them. Ronald Reagan chose to still be involved in the causes and the things that he cared about. He was very involved in Republican politics, although I would say he was very cautious as well not to backseat drive the presidency from the former president's chair. You know, his vice president, President Bush, went on to be president. So he was always very cautious to advise when George Bush asked for his advice, but to not second guess, because he knew that really, unless you're sitting in the Oval Office, you really don't have access to all the information that the sitting president does. So he continued to be a happy warrior, advocating for all the things that he had cared about and championed in his presidency, and tried to make himself accessible to people who maybe had wanted a chance to meet him in the Oval Office and didn't have that opportunity. And so his office was full of visitors, everybody from ordinary, everyday Americans who had written into him to former staff that perhaps had served him for 8 years and never got the chance to shake his hand, to world leaders who continued to come from all over the globe to meet with him and spend time with him because they had a friendship with him. It wasn't just a professional relationship on the world stage.
Peggy, what about the legacy, and maybe describe some of the leadership here? The two things that stand out to me from President Reagan's time in office, his 2 terms as president of the United States: the Reagan Revolution, that whole effort to reduce a reliance on government for people, and then peace through strength, so increasing defense spending. And I think what I read was by 35% or something like that. Those are 2 things. But what is the legacy of his leadership?
Yeah. You know, I think it is those things. Peace through strength certainly is something that President Trump has adopted as well. We see that the world relies on a strong America. We not only need our enemies to fear us, but we need our allies to trust us. And we see what happens when there's weakness on the world stage. We saw it under Carter. We're seeing it now, certainly under Joe Biden. So peace through strength was something that Reagan championed, and he backed that up by funding a strong military. I have people all the time write to me or reach out to me and say, I joined the US military because of Ronald Reagan. He made me proud to serve my country. He made me proud to be an American again. And that went not only for members of the military, but I think for the average American who said, we were proud of who we were under Ronald Reagan's leadership. We were proud to be Americans, and we felt safe and strong. We felt like we could invest in a new business or take a chance on a new idea and to innovate and to be entrepreneurs once again under his leadership. And so Reagan reinvigorated us through policies. But I would also say that as a young person watching him, he taught me that leadership, you can be strong, but you can also be kind. And I guess as a young person, I thought you had to choose, am I going to be strong and successful or a kind, good person? And Reagan showed that you could really be both. As much as he was strong and resolute and firm in what he believed, there also was always a twinkle in his eye and a skip in his step. And he was a happy warrior who championed his ideas and became a magnet toward those ideas and was the type of leader that people wanted to follow. And people did so throughout those 8 years, which were so prosperous and successful for the Reagan years.
You know, maybe we'll wrap up this segment, but 2 minutes or less. What's your favorite story in your time there, that decade with President Reagan?
Oh my goodness, there's so many memories that I have. I think it was seeing the world leaders come post-presidency, not because they had to for protocol or diplomatic reasons. They came because they wanted to. They had a friendship with Ronald Reagan that they wanted to continue. And so whether it was Margaret Thatcher or the former presidents or world leaders like Helmut Kohl or Prime Minister Nakasone from Japan, Lech Walesa from Poland. And then we even saw former adversaries like meeting Mikhail Gorbachev for the first time, hosting him up at the Reagan Ranch and seeing them very informally engage as friends. This was a man that Ronald Reagan had called out for leading an evil empire that he said was destined to fall upon the ash heap of history. His advisors had told him not to challenge and confront him, and yet Ronald Reagan did. And for the sake of history, aren't we glad that he did? And then to extend an olive branch of friendship to Mikhail Gorbachev, it really was remarkable to see in such a short period of time Ronald Reagan not only was a great president, but he was a giant among greats. And how fortunate I was to have seen him and witnessed that firsthand and to have the opportunity to talk and share about that.
Yeah, I loved reading your stories about that in your book, and I'll recommend that to everybody who's watching. You should check out her book, The President Will See You Now. Okay, Peggy, stay with us, and I'm asking you, our viewers, stay with us too. I'm going to ask Peggy Grande the question, what's next in politics? We'll look ahead at the incoming administration for President-elect Trump. Next on This Week in Jacksonville.
You're watching This Week in Jacksonville on Channel 4.
And Peggy Grande is our guest today as we shift to a focus on the new administration in Washington. So Peggy, your view, what's next? And really, how much different is Donald Trump 2.0 versus the experience 8 years ago?
Well, I am so excited about the next 4 years, and I think that the American people are ready and enthusiastic as well. And, having worked for Reagan and then working for President Trump, a lot of people have said, oh, they're nothing alike, are they? And I say, no, they actually have a lot in common. And I think we're going to see a lot of Reagan-esque success and Trump success continued in the next 4 years. And minus that detour in COVID, Donald Trump had some very successful years. Ronald Reagan was somebody who loved America and Americans of all kinds. He came from the heartland of the Midwest. He was raised in poverty. He knew what the average American was experiencing and the heartache and the hardship that they faced, especially under the Carter years. Similarly, I think Donald Trump has a heart for what the American people have experienced under the oppressive leadership of Joe Biden and the failed administrative leadership worldwide. And so Donald Trump is stepping in to fix that, to offer relief to the American people. Because even though he was maybe raised in wealth in New York, he understands the average person and wants to give voice to the forgotten men and women. Because think of how he made his money as a developer. He worked with concrete layers and architects and framers and painters and plumbers and electricians and housekeepers. And so he really does know and have a heart for the American people. He also, very Reagan-esque likes to communicate directly to the American people. Ronald Reagan did it through Oval Office addresses where he would come through the lens of the camera from the Oval Office right into your living room on one of those old dial TVs that had 3 stations. And he did it in weekly radio addresses. Donald Trump, we know, uses social media to speak directly to the people, to bypass the filter of media and go directly to the American people. And so that is a very Reagan-esque trait that Donald Trump has adopted. And if you know, Make America Great Again was actually first said by Ronald Reagan and is something that Donald Trump has championed. And really, who could oppose the idea of making America great? Donald Trump has promised to usher in the golden age of America. I think he's going to do that because the American people have given him a mandate and they will give him the tailwinds that he needs to push through legislation and to usher in a new era in America. And I'm really excited to see what can happen in the next 4 years under Donald Trump's leadership.
Peggy, leaning on your experience there with President Reagan, broaden it out for me, beyond just the White House or at least the Oval Office. How can modern leaders apply what we see, what we learn from Ronald Reagan?
Well, we love inspiring leaders. And Ronald Reagan was certainly somebody that people wanted to follow and to believe in and to lean on their leadership. And we see already, Donald Trump isn't even president of the United States yet. And we see world leaders from all over the globe coming either physically or virtually to talk with him and to work on new partnerships and alliances. And so we see them coming to Mar-a-Lago. We see former opponents of his coming saying, how can we help? We know that America not only is in a bad place economically and domestically, but we know that our place on the world stage has left a void and a vacuum of power that our enemies have filled. And so the world is reaching out to America, looking to Donald Trump and saying, please restore American greatness, because we too rely on that. We want to feel safe and protected. We want to have an alliance that we know will be supported by America. And we want our enemies to fear us, and we want our allies to trust us. We're going to see that under Trump leadership the next 4 years, because we're already seeing it, and he hasn't even been sworn in.
And that reminds me, I spoke in October with Boris Johnson, the former prime minister there in Great Britain. He said something similar. The world is better when America is the leader and when America is strong. Hey, we're going to run out of time before I get too much farther down the road. But Peggy Grande, I appreciate it. I know that I'm going to try and catch up with you here in just a couple of weeks. You'll be there for the inauguration of the 47th president. Is that correct?
I will be in Washington and hope to be here the next 4 years serving alongside this great president to make America great again. And by proxy, we will also make the world safer and stronger under Trump leadership.
Yeah, I appreciate getting to chat about that. Like I said, viewers, we'll talk to Peggy Grande again. And Peggy, thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Kent.
All right, and as we get ready to move on here, just a reminder, we appear every Sunday morning at this time, streaming on News4JAX Plus, on air on Channel 4, and then noontime on the CW17. Hey, Rick Mullaney plans to be here next time. He's our political analyst. He's the founder of the Jacksonville University Public Policy Institute. We'll be looking ahead to inauguration. The new Congress just getting sworn in this week in the House of Representatives. Some of the division that's going on there about electing a new speaker. This Week in Jacksonville airs each Sunday morning at this time, and I'm Kent Justice. Thanks for watching on air on Channel 4 and the CW17 and online at news4jax.com or streaming on News4JAX Plus. And before you go, don't forget to check out our podcast, This Week in Jacksonville Business Edition. President Carter would have loved this one, by the way. This episode looks at one of the nation's largest philanthropic investment programs. It's called Neighborhood Builders. That's our topic. And so you can find new episodes every Thursday at 9 a.m. And you'll find it right now at News4JAX Plus under the channel This Week in Jacksonville. You'll also find This Week in Jacksonville Business Edition available wherever you find your podcast, like Apple, Spotify, or Google.
See why every day more people are choosing News4JAX, Northeast Florida and South Georgia's #1 source for local news.